Okay, Kaya, we should be ready to go.
Right. I call to order this January 28th, 2021 meeting of the Moab City Planning Commission at 6:02 p.m. In attendance, we have Planning Commission members John Knight, Kaya Marienfeld, Jessica O'Leary, Ruben Villapando Salas, Luke Wojciechowski, Assistant Planner Corey Shirtleff, Nora Shepard, Planning Director, Mike Duncan, City Council Member, Chuck Williams, City Engineer, and Eric Castle, Assistant Manager, City Manager, excuse me. We also have Becky Wells, Planning Commissioner, on as well. First item on our agenda is citizens to be heard. Do we have anyone for citizens to be heard this evening? I know we got a variety of emails relating to the water resources discussion that we're having later in the meeting.
I received a couple of citizens to be heard forms, but I don't have them pulled up. Give me just a second.
Great.
I had to reset my password today, so I can't seem to get to anything relatively quickly. So give me just a second.
No worries. We will wait.
Okay, we received one from Travis. I think it's Nauman. His comment was, I'm very concerned about water resources planning moving forward. Recent studies, USGS report and Gardner et al. Paper in Journal of Hydrology that have gone through extensive peer review indicate that we are already very close to safe yield within 0 to 1,000 acre feet. These also don't account for projections that our regions have a high probability of extended mega drought in the number of peer reviewed studies. It concerns me that Utah Division of Water Rights and other entities seem to think that we have 2,000 to 4,000 acre feet left before safe yield based on Ken Colm's work. The problem is that Colm's work has not gone through peer review and ignores the emerging scientific evidence that a substantial portion of the Glen Canyon aquifer is a deeper, slower moving body of water. I would urgently advise the commission to push for further vetting of Colm's work and to give the other more robustly studies more consideration in future water planning and lobbying of the Utah Division of Water Rights. And the second one was from Bill Love. And he said, we need to know the total amount of water that will be used in the next year or year and a half after all of the construction below is completed. This is the total of Moab City current water use plus use by approved construction plus used by proposed college plus the 500 acre feet that will be used in San Juan County, plus the 250 ERUs that SYTLA purchased from GWISA when GWISA overran their budget on drilling their water wells over 15 years ago, plus GWISA current use and Grand County approved construction. We could add the water needed to keep the golf course green and the arena green next year due to the drought. As of now, there is no snow in the LaSalles. This will need coordination between the county and the city. 2, we also need to know what is the water needed for build out in the city and county under the current land use codes. When we have these numbers, we will probably need to find the millions of dollars necessary to tap the Colorado River. People need to know how many acre feet of land within the valley cannot be developed and when they can expect the city to close down all agriculture that uses groundwater for irrigation. Residents have the fantasy that there is water for building out their property and the city and county cannot take their water. When will the city stop all agriculture using groundwater in the valley to provide water for more development and to keep the golf course green and arena green? I get complete silence when these subjects are proposed, except for Mike Duncan. Those are your 2 comments.
We received written versions of both of those, along with 3 other written comments that the Planning Commission probably got twice because I forwarded them just to make sure that you got them. So we did receive 5 comments.
Correct. All right, sorry, I muted my microphone. This evening, we just have a discussion item as the comments were referring to item 3.1, water resources in Moab. So I think we can take it away.
Okay, so Carly, Chuck, and Mike are all going to give PowerPoint presentations. Yay! And this is similar to an exercise they did with the City Council in December, just really to start the conversation. And then Chuck can talk about some other work that he's been doing with the City Council to try to kick off some conservation efforts. So I'll just hand it over to whomever wants to go first.
I don't see Chuck on my screen right now. Do you guys see him?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. Yeah, there you are. Sorry about that.
Okay.
With
Carly?
the city council, yeah, we had Chuck go and then me and then Councilmember Duncan. I think that worked last time because I know that Chuck and I sort of provide an overview of water resource management policy, and Chuck also provides an overview of all of the studies that have been done. So it kind of sets the stage.
So I guess I'll go ahead then. Everybody's good with that?
Yep.
Okay, on this full wolf moon before the next storm comes in. Let me share my screen. Can you see a PowerPoint slide there? Okay, yeah. Good. Thanks. So this is a PowerPoint that we put together for a work session with council back in December. I've made a few modifications based on developments since then, but I think it'll help the discussion that I believe you want to have this evening or in the future. Purpose was to update the commission on the overall status of water resources in the Moab Spanish Valley regarding the recent scientific reports regarding available water quantity. There's 4 of them, and I'll talk about those. Potential future water management / conservation measures, which both Carly will talk about in detail, and schedule of upcoming system investments. One of the things that I'll show in a minute is right now where there's a lot of discussion and talk about how much groundwater there is, but we got to remember that, you know, we're a city that's 115 years old, and we've got a water distribution and storage system that we have to maintain, as well as providing the resource. So here's kind of an overview of what our culinary water system is. We operate on 4 springs and 3 wells, 2 of which are culinary and 1 of which is an irrigation well. And the majority of those are out in the golf course area. We have 3 1 million gallon storage tanks, about 48 miles of pipe under the ground. That's for in the city. The source protection areas, which are the areas designated, and there's a process to do so that we've done for the wells and the springs to protect them from contamination, essentially, about 35 square miles. Total water use, it's a range between 1,800 and 2,400 acre feet per year. That varies based on how wet of a year it is. It also varies on equipment failing or not failing, but we're in that range. We feel pretty confident. We're very confident about that. Connections, which I think this is an interesting number. This is again in the city, 1,746 residential and 562 commercial. So that's quite a bit of commercial connections for a total of about 2,300 connections in the city or customers. And that's based on 2019 data. So there's always a little bit of lag in analysis and data. The city's water system is funded by the Water Enterprise Fund. It's a designated fund as allowed by state law. So it doesn't mix with some of the other funds. Annual budget's about $1.25 million, though that varies somewhat. This year, last year, council raised rates for the first time in a long time to help us achieve some objectives that need to be achieved. Hydrology, not to belabor the point, but I like the bottom sentence here. It's all of the physical, chemical, and biological processes involving water as it travels its various paths in the atmosphere, over and beneath the Earth's surface, and through growing plants, are of interest to those who study the hydrologic cycle. And the point there, and the reason I like it, is we have different specialists who are involved in different elements of hydrology. You know, I was trained in hydrology. I wasn't trained in geochemistry. But there are geochemists who play a role in the hydrologic cycle and understanding the hydrologic cycle. And plants, evapotranspiration is a key component of as well as what's underground and what falls from the sky. Legal standards, you'll hear a lot about these. Michael talks some more about these, I know. Safe yield was mentioned in one of the emails. Essentially, it's from Utah code. And if you think about it, there's water that gets into the groundwater from the sky, essentially, and then we withdraw that water. So there's recharge and discharge. So safe yield is the amount of groundwater that can be withdrawn from a groundwater basin over a period of time without exceeding the long-term recharge of the basin. So think about that as a balanced system. The way I think of safe yield is you're not going to withdraw more than is being recharged into the basin on an annual basis. Water rights, you hear a lot about water rights, and a water right is a right to divert or remove from its natural source and beneficially used water. Sometimes people will call them paper rights, but there's much more to it. There's legal status associated with those water rights and paper rights. And generally the older rights have a higher priority. Not always true, but generally speaking it is. So you may hear them saying first in time, first in right. I'll talk a little bit more about water rights in a little bit. What is an acre foot? I apologize if this is too simplistic, but I think it helps visualize it. So an acre foot is a term of art that's used in understanding groundwater usages. One way to look at it is it's about 325,851 gallons. The easier way to think about it, at least visualize it for me, is it's about the size of a football field. 1 acre of land is more exactly about 1 foot deep. So that's why it's an acre that's 1 foot deep is really what the definition is. And Ken's Lake, when full, holds approximately 3,000 acre feet. And I'll mention that again in a little bit to think about what 3,000 acre feet is used on an annual basis here in the valley and here in the city. I think this is a nice graphic borrowed from DWR. Here's the LaSalle's. This is the red being a watershed boundary. So this is the watershed. The water that falls within these red lines heads down into our system that feeds the Moab Spanish Valley and the aquifer that the city and Gwissa and Moab Irrigation, we all use. You see Castle Valley out there to the east. They're in their own watershed on the other side of this red line. There's Grand Staff here. So here's Pack Creek coming down on the west side of the valley, down in the lowlands. You can see the golf courses right in here. And I mentioned earlier that this is where our wells and springs are at. And then Mill Creek, of course, moves down to its confluence with the Colorado River. And then Mill Creek comes down from the LaSalle's. North Fork comes down. Here's Powerhouse Dam as just a place that most people know where it is. So you can see that the valley, and here's Ken's Lake. Yeah, Ken's Lake, I think most locals know it, but Ken's Lake was built in the 80s, early 80s, and is fed by diverting water from the Mill Creek through the ridge and down Faux Falls and into the lake itself for irrigation storage. But this kind of I think it's a nice visual to understand our system. Shifting gears to publications. So there's a groundwater management plan that's being talked about from the state in the next few years. I haven't heard an exact date yet, but as part of that, people have been preparing for the groundwater management plan. So some studies, some agencies banded together. City was a stakeholder on the USGS study, which is one of them, known as the USGS report. And there's its title, and that took about 2.5, 3 years to complete. And USGS, of course, the U.S. Geological Survey, they did a combination of field work and modeling and evaluation of the system using chemistry, physics, some classic hydrological methods. The Gardner report, which Mike will talk about in more detail, I believe. Mr. Gardner, or Dr. Gardner, was a member of the USGS team and geochemist, I believe, by training. And he takes more of a geochemical approach to his conclusions regarding groundwater availability in the system and what's happened in the system. Then there are the Coleman reports, which Dr. Coleman works for the city. He's made 5 reports, 5 phases. The last phase is in draft form now, and we expect it within the month or less, specifically about safe yield. And he takes more of a classic hydrogeologic approach to understanding the groundwater and water balances in the system. Then the city has done a water distribution and storage master plan. The water distribution and storage master plan is there are requirements in state code over how you conduct that water distribution and storage master plan. As opposed to a purely scientific, let's take this approach to it. They have, of course, science in it, but they also have their methodologies that we follow. And that was completed and updated in 2020. And I'll talk about those results. And the other one I'll show you here in a moment, some of the results, but so UDWR, the State Division of Water Resources, they took the USGS report, looked at it internally, felt that they could come to some different conclusions using some of that, a lot of that information. And I'll show you that information in a moment. So what my staff and I have done is we've taken in all those reports and gone through them repeatedly and trying to sort out some commonalities between them, with the idea being, in my mind, it's not so much as a geochemical approach better or a classic hydrologic approach better. It's the approach on, is it give us a viable answer regarding safe yield, whether discharge will ultimately equal recharge, or are we mining the basin? Are we overusing water, or are we still in good shape, or, for the time being? So that's what this table is going to be here. So discharge, I'll just pull one up. So the USGS, they give a range, which is fair. I mean, none of it is black and white, I assure you. But it's all the best, it's developing science, it's using new technologies, it's interpretations, it's responding to changes in climate. But still, there's a range with a minimum discharge of 13,000, again, acre feet per year, to 15,000 acre feet per year. And suggesting that what's available that's not being used out of that is 300 acre feet per year to 1,000 acre feet per year. So that's water that's not being consumed in the valley, not necessarily by the city of Moab, but by Grand Water Sewer Service Agency, as well as the San Juan portion of our valley. UDWR, who built upon the USGS data, or analyzed it and came up with some of their own conclusions. They are more suggest that the discharge is between 10,800 and 16,600. So, you know, call this 11,000, call this 16,000. Those are pretty close, right? 11,000 to, because again, it's not perfect. Their conclusion on the available water is there's between 1,300 acre feet and 3,500 acre feet. So there's a difference in there, but it's not an order of magnitude, meaning it's not 10 times greater than the other report. Gardner suggests that there's a discharge of 13,600, which is similar to the 13,000 over here. And he basically says, well, what we use is what's available. And so he says there's no more available, or what we use, what's available is what we use. Excuse me. Dr. Colm suggests that the discharge is 12,600 and 2,400 is available. So here's 4 reports, if you will, 4 methods. Call this 13,000, 13,000. The middle of those is about 13,000. This is middle, this is 14,000. Those are all really close, in my opinion. For some of this work was done independently. Some of this all uses some of the same data. It's just looking at the data in different methods. Dr. Colm reports he thinks there's a 2,400 acre feet of available. 0 there on Gardner, 35. Call to split the difference here, may have 2,500. Over here, about 800. Again, everyone would like to know the exact number. But this is not an exact science. It's good science, but it's not an exact science. So they're all within a range. And the Water Master Plan doesn't take the approach of what discharge is and availability. What the Water Master Plan does is say, how much is the current city use? And they use, we monitor our wells in our system. You know, we monitor water bills. And the current city use in the master plan for 2019 was reported to be about 2,395 acre feet per year. And one of the interesting things about the water master plan, which the state requires, is that we do what's called a 40-year projection. And that 40-year projection is based on growth rates. It's based on water availability, historic growth rates, projection growth rates, zoning. And the projection there was 3,801, 40 years from now, essentially. Well, none of these numbers are 3,800. You know, they're all less than 3,800, which means, if nothing else, again, if this is as exact as that, it's appropriate to be looking at water and water resources as we live here in Moab Spanish Valley. Everybody asks, do we have enough water? I don't have the answer. The estimated physical water availability is that range of between 0 to 3,500 acre feet, as I explained a couple slides back. The available city water rights, remember, these are the right to use water. We have 9,633 acre feet. And you saw that in the year 2060, we might need 3,800. So the people before the existing council and existing staff, I can tell you, I've been through every one of those water rights. They did an incredible job by accumulating water rights on behalf of the city. And that's a good thing, but as you can see, our need is less than the water rights that we have, which is a really good position for the city to be in. More scientific word is needed to reach consensus as to the amount of undeveloped water available. I worry less about that because I think we've now got those 4 studies there, 5 studies actually, that show that the results are pretty much close enough together to say that we certainly should be undertaking improved water management actions and perhaps conservation. And with that, there you go. I have a bullet for it. Water management conservation measures should be enhanced to make the most of the water we have. We may be able to reduce our usage through better management and conservation practices. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Carly to talk more about management and conservation practices. And if you want to hold for any questions to the end, Kaya, or do you want me to answer questions
now? I think just because there's quite a bit of content in each portion, perhaps if folks have questions, we can go portion by portion. That seems to, at least that's how my brain works. If other commissioners agree, we can just go ahead and ask Chuck questions based on what we've seen so far. Nora, what were you saying?
I have a question. So Chuck, the number that says that the use that we have right now is a city, the number of acre feet, is that including the golf course, or is that included in the county numbers?
That's would be in the, generally speaking, it's in the county numbers, because that's the golf course is primarily watered from Ken's Lake water for irrigation water, as opposed to pumping our culinary water into it.
Okay.
So those numbers don't include that. Generally speaking, there's a small amount that is used for fire suppression out there, but I think it's 50 acre feet, something like that. So very small.
Yeah, Chuck, forgive me. It was my impression the golf course was watered by a well out there that's drawing culinary water out of the same aquifer, but it's being used for golf course irrigation. Is that wrong?
Well, like I said, generally speaking, that's incorrect. Is my understanding from it. We have well number 7. That's the well you're talking about, is the one that when Ken's Lake water is not available for irrigation or to supplement, to be used for fire suppression, will pump out of well 7 for golf course irrigation. Is it culinary water quality? Yes, it is, because it's direct groundwater withdrawal. But the water at the golf course, most of the time, is coming out of Ken's Lake.
Okay, thank you.
On one of your first slides, you had a little thing showing connections and residential versus commercial. And I'm curious how the commercial are treated is like one hotel, one commercial connection versus one restaurant, or is there some other calculation in there to kind of take into account the number of rooms?
No, those are essentially accounts. So the same way a house has an account, for that house has a meter, a hotel will have a meter and an account. So then a 80-room hotel, as an example, was counted as a customer there, the same way a 25-seat restaurant will be counted. A separate restaurant would be a separate connection.
Maybe what she's asking, Chuck, are those units in ER equivalent residential connections, or are they just physical number of pipes that are connected to various sizes?
That's meter information. That's the connections to our system. It's not ERUs.
Okay.
We can come up with those numbers. I mean, those numbers, the system we charge on is based on that, but that's just a physical connection to the system. Those numbers that I showed.
I have another quick question. So what does 1 acre foot equate to? Is that like water for a year for a house? Or, how does that work with, how much a house uses?
It's somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of an acre foot per house per year is generally accepted number. I don't know exactly what number it is in Moab, but we're in that range. Mike, you may have a different, that's the number we.
Yeah. I think there's something in state code that says 400 gallons a day, which maps into about 4,500 hundredths. In other words, a little less than a half an acre foot per year at that rate.
Yeah,
for
it
one
is.
ERC.
And ours is, and I think we use a little bit less than that. So it's between a quarter and a third and a half, generally speaking.
Yeah, and Nora, the other answer to the question is acre feet really got started. It's really weird actually, because if you go way back in water rights allocations, to the 19th century, people really thought of how much water they needed, not in terms of volume of water, but in what kind of crops you were growing. And so the rule of thumb was typical crops might use 4 acre feet per acre per year. So if you had, 1 acre of hay, whatever example, then people would typically allocate you 4 acre feet per year for your 1 acre. Does that make any sense? So water intensive crops might take 4, 5, or 6, and less water intensive crops might only use 2 or 3, but 4 is kind of a ballpark number.
All right, thank you.
Hey, Chuck, thanks for this information. How do we compare to other communities in the Southwest? How are we doing on our water conservation? I know it's hard for us to gauge given the tourist nature of our community, but curious if we've looked at that.
In terms of water conservation, I think that I'm going to let Carly answer that more completely, because that's kind of where she's at her presentation tonight. She's leading the efforts for the city now to enhance our water management policies and our water conservation measures. But I would say that we're not the worst and we're not the best, to be quite honest with you, John, from what I've seen in other places, what I've researched, and knowing where we're at now. And that's why I think there's a room for improvement, but I think we're poised to make those improvements, I hope.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Hey, does anyone have any other questions for Chuck based on this first portion of the presentation this evening? All right, great. Was it Carly next or Mike? Can't remember.
Carly.
All right, great. Thanks, Carly.
Yeah. So thank you so much for having me tonight. I've been looking forward to this meeting for some time because water policy was my bread and butter up in Salt Lake City before I took a job here in Moab. And so I love talking about this area, and I am available to any of you if you have questions after this presentation or down the road. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be so happy to talk with you. And I also have a PowerPoint, lucky us. Let me find it here. I want to thank Chuck for giving that really great overview of our understanding generally of the water budget of the Moab Valley. And I know that the City Council is very interested in ensuring that our water supply is safe and secure. They've expressed that very clearly over the past few months. And I've heard from several community stakeholders that you want to make this a priority in the coming year and in the coming next few years. So I thought it might be helpful if we take kind of a step back and I explain a bit how someone like me thinks about water resource planning and management. And I think if I provide sort of some of that context, the ideas that Chuck and I have in mind will make a little more sense. So my background is in a discipline referred to as integrated water resource management or integrated water resource planning, which is a water industry term that refers to a process that promotes coordinated development and management of water, land, and related resources. And it's done to maximize economic and social welfare and without compromising natural systems. The APA uses a similar term to describe a process that looks holistically at like the planning and management of the water supply and the wastewater supply and stormwater supply. It focuses on like the water cycle as a single connected system and promotes coordinated development along that continuum for the system. And oftentimes these two terms and disciplines sort of interact with each other. It's not unusual that they both are deployed by a water resource manager or a water utility to achieve effective planning goals. And I just wanted to introduce you to some general water supply principles that guide the management of an integrated planning framework. The first, they're pretty straightforward, but I just wanted to sort of dig into pieces of them and give examples of how these are achieved so you can think of them in concrete terms. First, water planning should engage all levels of government and be carried out in concert with private utilities, suppliers, and environmental resource agencies to ensure that development and future water needs are consistent with availability and supply. This is a very kind of hot topic. I think a lot of the comments that you get are around anxiety about future water needs and our supply. So the question is like, how do we achieve a goal like this? How do we make this happen? First, you have to establish a reliable water supply. And this is what Chuck is referring to. The studies that we're doing is to understand our water supply and make sure it's reliable and make sure we understand the amount that we have. So as Chuck said, we have plenty of water rights, but those paper rights don't necessarily correspond with wet water. So we're trying to get our arms around that. We also want to determine and quantify our future growth needs. We've also done some work in this area, like a build out projection. Chuck knows more about those studies. They were done before I got here, and he can speak about those better if you have questions. And then you also establish and incentivize water conservation and water quality protection. So you get your supply and you make sure it's used prudently and you make sure it's protected from contamination, because we could have all the water in the world, but if it gets contaminated, it's useless to us. And if we just sort of burn through it, if we have a lot and we burn through it, we're also going to find ourselves in trouble. So sometimes the question, we get the question like, do we have enough water? And it really depends on how you manage it is one question. How you use it. So I'll come back to that kind of question too, of do you have enough, we have enough water, and how like someone in mine or Chuck's position sort of fleshes out that question and attempts to answer it. So a second concept is that land development plans should seek to achieve development that results in sustainable land use patterns, and that they have efficient use of the scarce or oversubscribed water resource. This is where a body like you come in. Planning commissions should have water in mind when they are planning for the community and approving development, future development, current development, all of those kinds of proposals in front of you. You do this by like protecting surface and groundwater supplies. You promote efficient water conveyance and use. We protect water quality. We facilitate water conservation. You require things like landscaping standards, development standards when it comes to what kind of water efficient materials you want to have used, or those kinds of things like gray water, efficient toilets, efficient showers, all of that. And then finally, the third point is related to infrastructure, which is a very critical part of proper water resource management, but it sort of gets forgotten because it's expensive and it's not as interesting as talking about the water supply. But a good infrastructure, a sound infrastructure, is very important to making sure we have enough water. So any policymaker should be prioritizing funding and construction of a water infrastructure that's designed, built, and maintained to protect and conserve water resources. So I hope those are all kind of clear principles. So keeping these principles in mind, when I look at our water supply system, what do I see as being our biggest vulnerabilities, and what should be our priorities to ensure we have an adequate water supply? Firstly, we have pretty undeveloped water conservation policies or programs. We do have a water board, their title is much longer, and they were recently created a couple years ago. Their focus has been on the water budget those past few years. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for them to start developing conservation policies or programs. We don't have like a landscaping ordinance. We don't have really low-hanging fruit that are very effective tools, time-tested tools that are used in many communities, especially in the West. But Moab just simply does not have them in code. We don't have a water conservation like program. We haven't had a sustainability director for more than a year. So this is like a real fertile ground for a lot of good impacts. And I'll talk more about those. This is what we're gonna flesh out for most of my presentation. We also have an aging water system. This has been talked about a lot at the council meetings. Our water system runs better than it deserves to because we have an excellent public works team. They're very fastidious and conscious of the system, and they take great care of it. But the truth is, it has not gotten the financial investment that it's needed for quite some time. So we can have all the water again in the world, but if we can't get it to anybody because a pipe, our PRVs are down or pipes are bursting, all the water doesn't really matter much if we can't deliver it. And if we can't deliver it reliably. We also have little control over the aquifer. So we share this aquifer with other users, and we don't regulate them. We're not out there making sure they're drawing as much as they should or shouldn't. And so we might do everything right on our end. We're really prudent, we're developing intelligently, we're managing our water resources wisely. But if they're not doing the same thing, we may be harmed. There might not be enough water for everybody. And then we also have little control over our source water protection. There are a couple of reasons for it. We get a lot of our water outside of city boundaries. So we don't necessarily have like extraterritorial jurisdiction to ensure that there aren't activities or development that harms our water quality. A good example of this, if you recall, was this spring when there was almost a proposed lease up Sand Flats, which is right over our source water protection zone. And it would have had really negative impacts to the integrity of our water supply. Fortunately, we were able to stop that with some really effective grassroots movement against that. But it's just an example of where we don't have total control over that situation, and we're very vulnerable to those things. So I want to talk about like where to go from here, given those vulnerabilities, given our needs. And Chuck and I have spoken and come up with a list of priorities that we're eager to explore and develop. And I can review these quickly. So continue refining the city's understanding of the hydrological system. This is the work that is ongoing with the intensive studies that are happening right now. The city is fully engaged in those, very interested in getting some good answers, as good an answers that we can get. We're going to prioritize developing and implementing water conservation policies. It's far past time that we do that. We're going to continue in promoting the investment in our infrastructure for our collection, storage, and distribution systems. I know those are things that Chuck and I are talking to the council about almost every week, how important it is to invest in that system. And that goes for our expanding water infrastructure as well. We're trying to build some resiliency and redundancy into our system with some additional infrastructure. We're going to be pursuing some water monitoring and data collection. I believe that's in this upcoming budget, or it has already been approved, I can't remember. We might explore things like partnerships with other water users as well as folks like Grand County, the BLM, to ensure that we are in a partnership with them when it comes to development impacts over our water sources, like I was speaking about earlier. And engage with other water users, WISA, San Juan County, Moab Irrigation. We're all part of the same system, and try to find a collaborative way to make sure we're all taking steps to protect these precious water resources. And then I also spoke in that earlier slide about the water conservation policies and programs. And John, hopefully this does answer some of your questions. These are a priority for us to develop. And I want to expand on it and take time with it because it's just, these kinds of policies are so foundational to like prudent water resource management. These practices I've listed, like I mentioned, are low-hanging fruit. Any water-wise community should have them in place. This is for several reasons. They're well studied, they're well understood. We're not going to be like reinventing the wheel, and that matters for a small community like Moab, where we don't necessarily have the resources of a larger municipality to go out and sort of forge our own path, you know, in cutting edge water conservation. They're also inexpensive, many of them, or there's funding available, grants available, and they're both politically and legally defensible. So those are all really important things to keep in mind. I also wanted to mention that like this is actually mandated by the state too. So we have to update our water conservation plan. It's due next year. And the state has set regional M&I goals or municipal and industrial goals for our region. We have to achieve a 20% reduction of our gallon per capita day by 2030. And that's from a 2015 level. So we have a lot of work to do. So I also kind of talked about, or just a minute ago, talked about the importance of having policies in place and programs that are legally and economically, or legally and politically defensible, economically defensible too, actually. These ones are as well. But the importance of that is something I can personally attest to in my work up in Salt Lake City. I mentioned this quote in the council meeting about a month ago. There's that Mark Twain quote that says, "In the West, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over." And from my time working in Salt Lake City, we had a lot of big water fights. This is maybe too much information, but back in the early 1990s, Salt Lake City enacted strict limitations on their surplus water contract sales in the central Wasatch Canyons. And they implemented a really simple and elegant regulatory regime, and it's very effective. But Salt Lake City has spent 30 years and substantial resources defending that policy and that ordinance in court and at the Utah legislature. So for someone as big as Salt Lake City, it's easier for them to have those big fights compared to someone like Moab. It would be quite onerous if we were sort of out in the front of anything more aggressive than something, the suggestions that I have here. So that's why I favor the time-tested water conservation practices that are on the screen, just because they're absolutely something we can implement, and I think they're easily defensible. And they're effective as well. So we also have, I know Chuck, did you want to, I'm gonna put you on the spot again. I believe I have a talk about some of our upcoming infrastructure investments. Do you want to go over those?
Yeah, I can talk about that quickly, Carly, sure.
Yeah, and 2 slides for you if you recall.
Yeah, I do. Only because it was a month ago. Any more longer than that, and I'm not sure I remember. Right now, we've got a design and permit for a replacement well, known as well number 12. It's designed, permitted through the state. It's going to help us. If you recall, previously I said we had 2 culinary wells and 1 irrigation well. This will give us 3 wells, which will help in terms of security of supply, we hope. So construction in the spring. There's a water bond coming before council here in the next month, next council meeting, or 2 council meetings that will pay for that. We're participating with an interagency coalition to monitor the aquifer. By that, I mean the state, the feds, multiple agencies have agreed to work with us cooperatively, because you don't drill wells every day. We'll use geophysical and geochemical methods to better understand the aquifer. It's a very complex, the Glen Canyon group is very complex. And I'm excited about that. And by cost sharing, it's low cost for the city, but we'll receive a lot of benefit from that. This one is important to us now. It's just system security and optimization. We're going to upgrade things like well houses. We have well houses, but they're old and they're in need of either remodeling or reconstruction, several of them, as well as we want to make sure that our facilities are secure from people with bad intentions. And that's budgeted in his bond as well. We'll start it in 2021, designing it. We'll begin it. We won't get it all done in 2021 or even 2022, but we'll continue that optimization. And optimization too means that there's some things we can do, like reestablish an interconnection agreement, or the plumbing with Grand Water and Sewer Agency, which used to be in place and then it broke and no one ever fixed it, which means that because they have their well fields and we have ours, in the event of a catastrophic failure, we could, help our neighbors. So when I talk about optimization, there's better ways we can manage our springs, I believe, as well. Next slide, Carter.
Hey, Chuck, question for you. Has anybody ever vandalized a well house? That kind of took me by surprise.
I've not heard of any vandalization, but I can tell you, having been to each one of our well houses and those facilities, it wouldn't take much to get into them. And and when I say security too, it's not just for people who want to do bad business. It's from rodents and animals and things like that. We have to keep our culinary water pure. But no, I've not heard of any since I've been here, Mike. I don't know prior to that.
Okay.
But there are standards, for what the state expects now. As an example, the new booster stations going in at Lionsback, they're going to be very secure, concrete block buildings, and that's what we envision for our well houses as well. Other projects that are coming up real quick is Mill Creek Drive waterline improvements. We've got a design complete and approved by the Division of Drinking Water. We'll start construction in the spring, and that essentially replaces 40, 50, 60-year-old lines from 400 East down Mill Creek Drive all the way out to Murphy Lane and up Powerhouse Lane as well. Spanish Valley water tank we have studies were done about 5 years ago. We need an additional water tank to improve fire flows. If there was a large fire, we'd be scrambling. And we're hoping that with some of this bond money, we can cost share with the Drinking Water Board to pay for that tank. The preliminary design is done. And that would be of value. And then there's other distribution system upgrades, part of heavy maintenance, if you will, places where we know we have 300 or 400 feet of pipe that need to be replaced because of the constant repairs that go on, fire hydrants, things like that. So I guess to finish up, our infrastructure improvements, we're looking at supply and distribution and storage, which are kind of the 3 key components of a culinary water system. So we're hitting all of those with this bond the council approved as part of their rate upgrade this last year. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chuck. I'll stop. Well, I don't want to new share. No, I want to stop sharing. So I'm happy to take some questions. I guess I wanted to let you know there's been some progress since the last time Chuck and I gave this presentation. At the council meeting on Tuesday, Chuck and I proposed that we develop in the coming months a time of day, day of the week watering ordinance. So that would be related to or would regulate sprinklered watering of outside, and would have people starting to water at night, not allowed during the day, as well as break up when the watering would happen. Truthfully, turf only needs to be watered 2 or 3 times a week. So we would start to space that out and hopefully get some water savings through that. That's a very effective tool. There's really a lot of savings available just by that simple change. The second ordinance that we're asking the council to implement is the authorization for us to develop a water shortage contingency plan. So a plan basically that would be tiered, probably 3 to 5 tiers, that would detail what the city is to do in case of a shortage of water. And the shortage could happen because of a loss of source, because of water contamination, because of a drought, because of a mega drought. So for any of those reasons, it would detail what kind of water restrictions would need to happen in order for us to still exist as a community, but maybe make some cuts temporarily while the shortage was existing. And I do know, and I'm happy to take questions, but going back to the question of do we have enough water? The answer is like, I don't know. It depends on how you use it. It depends on how you manage it. If we manage it poorly, no, probably not. No one would. If we're using it for monsoon crops, you know, out and we are doing a ton of agriculture and we're trying to grow rice, no, we probably don't have enough water for that either. But if we're being smart about development, if we're asking everyone to be conscientious about their water use, conscientious about the amount of lawn they have, if we have water efficient fixtures, certainly there's a future, but it does depend on the choices policymakers make and how well it's managed. So anyone have questions for me? Great, lovely.
I have one quick question. On the slide, you said the state is going to require a 20% reduction by 2030 from 2015 baseline. How does that take into account the changes not only in our population size, but also the fact that the state has been promoting our community pretty heavily for those 5 years?
That's a great question. So the baseline it's gallons per capita per day. So it's not the total amount of water we use, it's how much each individual, the per capita, is using. And we have a difficulty because our per capita isn't we have 30,000 people here.
Right.
Yeah, it will be it's measured against our permanent population. So that's like a difficulty for Moab. We have way more people down here and we have to be more efficient. The good news is though that like drinking water, you're taking a shower, all those kinds of things, that doesn't use as much water as you think. The water intensive uses is agriculture, it's watering the lawn. So, you know, folks who come and visit here aren't watering their lawns, they're going to a restaurant. And really it's easy to target that kind of behavior, right? So at a planning commission level, at the city council level, restaurants need to have water efficient fixtures. New hotels have to have water efficiency. You can bring water, all of that kind of stuff. It's their use is not as profound as it might sound immediately. It doesn't mean it's not impactful, but as far as so many uses, it's much more manageable. You know, grass needs a certain amount of water. You can't negotiate with it. But you can get more efficient when it comes to showers and toilets and those kinds of things.
Right.
Right. I believe it. Oh, yeah.
So what is the city of Moab's plan as far as updating water lines throughout the town? And how do we compare to other towns in the age of our infrastructure throughout this town?
I believe Chuck can answer that question better than I.
Sure. As part of the rate process that we went through with council this last year, we developed a 10-year capital improvement plan. Council didn't really pass the 10-year, it's more of a 7-year, just because of the severity of the rates that would be needed to address the longer term and the condition of the economy. But we have a plan, Becky, and like the Mill Creek Drive water line improvements I talked about, that's a $2 million project, our cost estimate is, but it's a big chunk of old pipe. And we have inventories of our pipes, and I'm going from memory now, and I've got another PowerPoint that would show you this, but it's something like 25% to 30% of our system is over 60 years old. So we're working on it. It's just a function of funding, honestly, as well as in a community of our size. We want to make sure we don't have too many construction projects going at the same time and bollocksing up people's ability to travel, and I mean locals. And how do we compare to others? I think now with those rate increase, I think we're on track to be making good progress like other communities our size.
Thank you. Question. Yes, I'm sure everyone noticed this last year with all of the water line breakages and, flows. It's concerning. So that's good to know.
And if I may, real quick, one of the problems that I've learned in my time in Moab, and it's not just Moab, but this town seems to have developed in phases, and different parts of the valley or the city developed at different, like at the height of the uranium mine, or there was a need for housing, and the pipes that were put in some parts of this town were really shallow, right? And some of what you saw this winter, this season, is those are some of our shallowest pipes, and the freeze gets through the ground and gets to the pipes and will break. And that's what causes some of the flooding that you saw from a broken system this year, and it's happened other years as well. So as we have new standards that require pipes to be deeper, like 5 feet deep. We want them 4 to 5 feet deep. The frost depth there is 2 feet, generally speaking. So we're trying to repair old stuff that maybe wasn't as installed the way we would install it today.
Thank you.
All right. I am done with my presentation if there are no other questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Carly. That was super good. It's really, I did not realize you had that depth of a background on this issue. So it's really great. We're really happy you're here. All right. Finally, last but not least, I think, Mike, your time to kick it off.
Yeah, thank you, Kai. Thank you guys for having me here. I am struggling. This is embarrassing with this computer. I've done, I don't know, countless Zoom meetings and sharing screens. Everything's worked just fine. And tonight, I pulled up this presentation before the meeting started, and now my panel at the bottom is dead. So let me try sharing the screen and see what happens. But oh, looky there. How about that? You guys see that?
Yep.
Okay, good. Are you guys want me to proceed? So there's almost 40 charts in this thing. The first half of them are kind of top level stuff, and I probably won't try to present the other half. Any kind of luck, I'll get through this in about 20 minutes, and that'll give us another 10 minutes for questions. But so I'll kind of gloss over stuff that Carly and Chuck have already talked about. But anyway, so what's new, all right, and what precipitated this presentation was Phil Gardner's report that Chuck and Carly have already talked about, which we always thought we had some, a few years worth of water to grow on. Now we're not sure. And the groundwater management plan is coming up. The MOPS, Moab Area Watershed Partnership, is coming up. Arnie Holtquist chairs that board. And he's hoping to get a Zoom conference going in with the chief scientists in this. That's what I'd like to see. That would include Dr. Gardner, Dr. Colm, people from the US, not USGS, but UGS as well. And see where any disagreement lies. Part of this is just talking apples and oranges for the differences in the numbers. But there's some real questions about, in particular, Dr. Gardner's model about the one that says, well, gee, we're withdrawing about 3,500 acre feet a year, and he calculates that's about what is being recharged. That's where the safe yield number comes in. But I'm getting ahead of myself. But I just want you guys all to notice that 2 to 3% doesn't sound like much over the years, but it adds up. Well and spring levels are declining. I'll show you that in a moment. Periodic little snow in the mountains like this year, we were way below normal as of 10 days ago. The last snowfall has helped a little. Periodic summer drought, you guys saw that. We're in a La Nina precipitation cycle right now. That tends to bring dry conditions to the southwest part of the country. Mary O'Brien sent me some nice charts put out by another organization that showed that very nicely. We're right in the heart of things. Of course, climate change is on our back. It's getting hotter. Chuck's talked about acre feet. He showed you this chart as well. The only other thing I want to point out is I'm on the board of Moab Irrigation Company. If you guys, a lot of people have asked about this. You go out and look at Mill Creek right now, for example, 24/7. There's a pretty fair amount of water running in that creek. And in the middle of the summer in the daytime, it can be run bone dry. So what's going on? Well, the reason is that Moab Irrigation Company's irrigation season lasts from about the middle of March to the end of October. And then by law, about that time, they're required to cut off all the diversions and water returns to the creek. But what you're seeing running in there right now, I mean, if we ignored the snowfall and rain and stuff like that, the water would still be running for some time. And that's so-called base water. That's water that flows, that originates as precipitation in the high mountains. It becomes groundwater. And then as Mill Creek in the mountains cuts down steep slopes, the creek is said to be gaining again. In other words, the groundwater returns back to Mill Creek to become surface water. And Moab Irrigation Company, their water rights date back to 1890, and they own all those surface rights out there right now. And a typical thing for growing municipalities to do is to appropriate or buy, whatever it takes, agricultural water. But I can tell you guys now, I'm sure you know, that most people in the area really like the agricultural aspects of it. So that's could be a difficult trade. And there's other little colored lines in here. That's Moab Irrigation Company's ditches down in town. There's one way out east of town for mostly folks that are farming out by Powerhouse Lane area. And then there's two more ditches, one on the north edge and one that runs through the center of town. I'm happen to be on the one on the north edge, cuts across my lawn. But at any rate, we've talked about, we'd like to get people in town who are watering the lawns on good culinary water off that, and instead water it on surface water, which is quite a bit cheaper and not so difficult to treat and so forth. So that's a subject that we've had quite a few times. Here's another chart. Chuck showed this. Shows the two aquifers in the area. We oftentimes talk about the so-called valley fill aquifer, this guy over here. It's got a lot of gravel on top and it's underlaid by Glen Canyon Group. It kind of disappears in the middle of the valley out here. The Glen Canyon Group is this area over here. It's coming down Sand Flats, North Fork, and Main Fork of Mill Creek. And as Chuck says, it's very complicated, which makes this thing a bear to understand. Oh no. Oh Lord. Well, let me try backing this up, kids, see what's going on here.
Mike?
Yeah.
download it.
Let me try that. Let me try this here. Oh, good. It came back alive. You guys still see that?
Good.
Okay,
Yes.
good. All right. So this is a nifty chart now that's part of the Division of Water Rights website. It's taken largely from monitoring wells drilled by the USGS over the years. They put in a whole bunch of new wells with the last study that was done that Chuck pointed out. What you want to notice is that back in 1970s, we had kind of a dry period in town and the well levels were down somewhat. Long about the time Kens Lake went back in, water levels started rising. 1982, I think, was the last time Lake Powell overflowed at the dam. So water levels look pretty good, but they've been declining ever since. There's seasonal fluctuations in here. Sometimes I'm inclined to dispense with the modeling and so forth, which are full of uncertainties, and just look at whose wells are sinking as an indicator of how well groundwater levels are going and to what extent we're actually mining the aquifer. This is kind of oriented in northwest to southeast order down the valley. You may notice that the wells on the top at the northwest end don't appear to be dropping as much as the ones down at the southeast end of the map, for what that's worth. So Mark Stilson is far and away the most important guy in this whole discussion, all right, because he doesn't actually make the final decision. The state's chief Division of Water Rights engineer does. That's not Mark, but it's his boss. But Mark will have a huge amount of input in what sort of decision is made. Mark gratefully is coming around in the last few years to realizing that we don't have a lot of water to grow on. Having said all that, he's not at all convinced. He's not ready to accept Dr. Gardner's report. Not that he particularly disputes it, he just wants to understand it better and understand the error terms that go into it and so forth. We'll get to what Gardner did here in just a moment. And I say that's what really precipitated this latest round of work. The city gets back to the city now that we presently assume we can serve water. We don't even ask for will serve letters. I had 8 years on the county planning commission and we always had will serve letters. We don't even bother with that because we think we had a lot of paper water rights. Either wasn't a problem. Well, there is. And you guys all know John Wesley Powell. Everybody's been out on a raft, which is just about everybody. Years of drought and famine coming, years of flood and famine come, and the climate has not changed with dance, libation, or prayer. And as soon as we start making restrictions on new water, we're going to hear all those arguments all over again. So I wrote this in part to encourage council this year to lay the infrastructure for making better track of water by, again, metering new requests for residential or commercial water, probably enumerate those things in equivalent residential connections. One ERC is 400 gallons a day, about a half an acre foot a year. And obviously we're going to participate in a groundwater management plan process that DWR heads up. I do not want to wait. Mr. Stilson likes to have all his ducks in a row. I understand that. But meanwhile, we've got growth proceeding. USU is going in, as Mr. Love points out, and new hotels and stuff in the pipeline. Things are kind of frozen right now. Overnight accommodation, that's another subject, guys. But anyway, there's new water and groundwater management plan process. Completion is likely a few years away, and I don't want to wait that long, frankly, to start laying groundwork. Carly mentioned that at the last council meeting, we're considering a time of day and time of week, day of week ordinances and further restrictions on water use. And that's a great idea as well. But further on that, I'd like to get more ordinances on the books about how we might meter water. What do we mean by metering? Well, we have to talk about it, but it would, a few ideas, explicitly accepting or denying requests for new water and planning apps. That would be you guys. Better records of such requests. Perhaps a new annual ERC quota, a maximum ERC limit for any particular application. You can offer ERC bonuses for conservation or secondary water use. I'm sure the rules will be periodically amended, and people who contribute their own water basically wouldn't be subject to this sort of restriction. So that's the idea, and you guys should lean on me to make sure Emily gets it on our agenda from time to time, but it'll likely it'll be in your ballpark, Mr. and Mrs. Planning Commission, before we see it at council. So it's important that you guys come up to speed on this. We're talking about culinary drinking water here, not irrigation water. It's a little bit different thing. And we're talking about ground now, not surface water. Chuck pointed out water rights are not the issue, aquifer capacity is. Here's my numbers as I added them up. They're similar to what Chuck has. 2,300 acre feet for the city, another 1,100 acre feet for the county, and Spanish Valley, San Juan County, Spanish Valley Special Service District has one well in now that's approved and running for 500 acre feet. They want 5,000 out of a number of points of diversion up there. That's a whole thing. That's where the 15,000 people in the south end of the valley come from. And back in 2011, the DWR granted them that 5,000 acre feet of water rights conditionally, thinking at the time that we had more like 20,000 acre feet to grow on. And that was before the latest USGS study came in. So then how much water would he have to use? That's, as we've all said, it's a fuzzy number. We've got three estimates here that Ken has already, that Chuck has already summarized for us. So let's go into a little more detail about how the history of the city's water supply. Anybody know how we're supposed to be pronouncing? I've heard Skakel and I've heard Skakel. Anybody know for sure which way it's supposed to be?
Our water guys call it Skakel.
Skakel. Yeah, all right. Well, there you go. So it's up near Moab Springs Ranch for a long time. That was the only water supply the city needed. In the 1950s, when the uranium boom hit, the city purchased there's two George Whites apparently, but this is a George White of Red Cliffs fame ranch, which is now the golf course area. And there's 3 springs out in that area and a couple of more wells that we're using. Number 6 and number 10. Chuck's talked about the new number 12 that's coming up, as well as number 7 that's used for golf course irrigation. Chuck, forgive me here because I keep getting this wrong. You're quite correct. I think they do use the majority of their water out of Kens Lake. I want to point out to you guys that the county, I go to those board meetings, they're all in a tizzy, all right, because we had a dry summer last year. Snowpack is low this year. Everybody's wondering how in the heck are we going to get through next year's irrigation summer, because Kens Lake is already bone dry. It's down to like 400 acre feet. That's a sort of a conservation minimum designed to keep water coming down the creek and to keep the fish alive in Kens Lake and so forth. So they're already talking about leasing more water from private users out there to try to get through next summer. They had one of their big heavy hitters of culinary water well, that's a Chapman well, go down for several weeks on them, cost them a lot of money to fix. And we had one of our own wells, I believe, Chuck, you guys can tell me more, that went down for a shorter period of time. And that's one reason we want to have a new well, is when we lose one, we'll have a backup. So the county, they depend on George White wells number 4 and 5, the Chapman well. There's another one called Spanish Valley well, is way out at the southeast edge, which is a very deep well and not a particularly good well, is my understanding. So they got about 1,100 acre feet that was reported to DWR last year. So now we come to San Juan County. I've already talked about all this, blah, blah, blah. Here's just a sample of the points of diversion that 2011 application asked for. The good news from our point of view is that these are all junior water rights. It's first come, first serve in this state. And if it can be shown that them sucking water out of these points of diversions impacts another existing user with senior water rights, then that's a conflict that would tend to favor the senior water rights holders. So we'll see how all this plays out. They do, if they can't get it up from the Glen Canyon Aquifer out here, they can suck it out of the river, but they'd have to go down the Cane Creek drainage, I believe. And that's a very expensive proposition, not only to put in the pipes, and the Cane Creek drainage is really a nightmare if you guys ever walked and hiked out there. And it's also expensive to pump it up from the river. So that would put a damper on growth out there. So our present total Glen Canyon group withdrawal, I come up with 3,800 acre feet. We're all in the same bark, 34, 35, 36, 38, somewhere in there. And as Chuck said, it varies from year to year since culinary water is used for irrigation of lawns. One heads up for you guys, virtually everybody I talk to says they want to blame our water shortage on overnight accommodations. That's not the case. When Rosemarie Russo was here, she, in her 2019 sustainability plan, she figured that overnight accommodations were only about 15% of our total irrigation uses. And that's because they don't do a lot of irrigation work. I know in the landscaping ordinances, the improved standards that we've been talking about for OAs, we are talking about landscaping restrictions, and that'll help some, but I think if we're really going to meet the 2030 goals that the state has put out for us, that we're going to have to be talking about, the area is going to look more like Phoenix, frankly, green infrastructure and xeriscaping and all that kind of good stuff. We'll talk about that later on. At 3,800 acre feet doesn't talk about the lower Spanish Valley Springs, things like Matrimony Springs or private wells. I know up in Cayenne Heights, for example, there's a number of people up there with wells 200 or 300 feet deep. And I believe a couple of them that I know personally are talking about how their well levels have been dropping somewhat. But anyway, Phil Gardner came up in his report of 3,600 acre feet for existing withdrawals. That's nice to know we're on the same page. So now how much water do we have to use? So there's 3 techniques. This makes things reading really confusing, all right? The first obvious way to do it is by modeling groundwater recharge by precipitation, which is snow or rain largely by snow. It's difficult to do accurately. It's hard enough because everything varies by altitude. And that's not enough. You got to know how much actually infiltrates into the ground. It's very complex mountainous terrain up there. So there's big error bands on trying to model groundwater recharge by precip. USGS did do it, but the top number on that is a fairly large number, and the bottom number is less than what we're doing now. So it's not a huge help. So what the USGS did do for the report largely is by observing discharge, which we can meter a lot better and give us better accuracy estimates. But you have to assume now that recharge equals discharge, which is a way of saying, if you think of the aquifer as being a bucket of water, there's a chart later on in this presentation that shows, like, I think of a beer cooler sitting on the back of my pickup truck, and, let water out the bottom and water comes in the top. It's a way of, when I say recharge equals discharge, it means that in the long run, the amount of water in storage up in the mountains hasn't changed, and there's no easy way to verify that, okay? Dr. Colm has made a stab at it, but it's not easy to do. And you can use various combinations of these techniques. Chuck has already pointed out the 3 studies, so I won't get into them. I have a little bit different way of adding up some of the numbers. The one thing I will point out about the USGS study is that 30,000 acre feet looks like a nice big number. I'm sorry, let's go down to the discharge number, 13 to 15,000 acre feet. That still looks like a pretty sizable number compared to the 3,600 of discharge that we looked at. But the biggest piece of that by far is roughly 5,000 acre feet that comes down Mill Creek. Okay, and again, those are surface water rights that belong to somebody else. And unless you're willing to purchase all that and dry up Mill Creek, it's really not going to do us a lot of good. And Chuck, by the way, that's one of the reasons Mark Stilson did something different. He added up differently in his charts. And that's one of the reasons DWR has a somewhat different estimate than what these numbers are here. So it's another apples and oranges thing. Both methods are subject to variable climate data, and these do count groundwater in the whole watershed, not just in the Glen Canyon aquifer, but in the Valley Fill aquifer too. So for all these reasons that we don't have as much water as you might want to think, Dr. Colm, as Chuck said, has come out with 4 reports so far that I've seen. Phase 1 just laid groundwork. Phase 2 had some very useful source protection zones for the city springs. Phase 4 proposed an expanded monitoring plan for the area's groundwater table. I can tell you guys right now, water is going to get to be more expensive because if nothing else, we're going to want to do more monitoring, more science. I mean, you want to extract the last drop, you're going to have to know more about what's actually out there. Phase 2 and 4 presented water budgets for the Glen Canyon Aquifer and the Valleyfield aquifers, respectively. So what they say, Ken thought that there was 18,000 acre feet per year of water passing through what he called a water budget area. It's not quite the same thing, it's just measuring discharge. Ken took advantage of certain geologic layers around all this area that's shaded here in colors, called them no flow boundaries. And then he just assumed that all the ground and surface water that was coming in or out was just at a few convenient little points, like one up here in the northeast corner, a more important one at the southeast corner, and one very important one where Mill Creek comes out of the mountains over there on the east edge of the valley. He did, however, conclude that he thinks, and he admits that there's a lot of room for error in here, that we could well be depleting the Grand Canyon aquifer without really putting a number on it. I'm not happy making any formal legal decisions based on just the work that Chuck did, but we're going to use get all these guys together. I'm hoping by the time summer rolls around that we will, at MOPS, for example, that Mark will get Colm and Gardner, UGS, all together and thrash this all out in person. So we're going to have to wait for COVID to get over with, but I'm looking forward to it sometime this summer with any kind of luck. Ken didn't, because he wasn't so big on water chemistry, he didn't use some nifty techniques that Dr. Gardner did. So I have more confidence in what Gardner did. Let's just put it that way. So what did Gardner say? The Journal of Hydrology article, he thinks that there's 3,400 acre feet per year of recharge in what he called a deep Glen Canyon aquifer. We've been talking about the aquifer now as being 3 sedimentary layers with Navajo on top and Kayenta in the middle and Wingate at the bottom. You guys are familiar with Wingate, that's the cliff formers in the area. The Kayenta is thought of as being permeable all the way through so that water can flow through it. But Phil now thinks that if they could do the whole thing again, he thinks there are sections where the Cayenne is not particularly permeable, not particularly porous. So there's places where it doesn't really, it acts more like a confining layer than it does like a flow layer through it. So if that's the case, then he talks about water flowing deep in the aquifer as opposed to water flowing shallow in the aquifer. The shallow part is where Mill Creek water would pick up their water from. The deep part, which tends to take longer because it's a longer path length. With carbon-14 dating, Phil has concluded the water up here in the recharge area doesn't exit for 2,700 years until it actually makes it down to the valley. In other words, and basically what Phil does, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, is if you know what the cross section of this area is and the length there, in other words, know what this pipe looks like, and there are errors in that, and you know what the difference in age is, then you can infer how fast water is coming into this aquifer. And that's what we want to know. What's the recharge rate? So do we have culinary water to grow on? It's what we all want to know. And all I can say is, I don't know, but less than you think. And the Utah Division of Water Rights is the authority who determines the legal safe yield value, which has not yet been established. And Mark is reluctant to put a number on it until we have some confidence in what it's going to be. And having said that, no matter what number we assign to it, I am sure it will be revised from time to time as new research comes in. But when it's established, if it's in the 4,000 acre feet ballpark, it would imply that there are no new net withdrawal from the Glen Canyon aquifer. Doesn't matter what your paper water rights are, you can't take anything more, which means that if you want to stick another pipe into it, you're going to have to pick up less water somewhere else. It also raises the risk of if you pump too much from wells and the springs would dry out. Nobody wants that either. But this is certainly a paradigm shift for local governments, all right, because for 100 years now and more, people thought there's plenty of water in the valley. And sure enough, with enough demand on it, we're running out of that. Chuck talked about safe yield, so this is the same chart. If the Glen Canyon group were closed to new aquifers, what other water resources could be tapped for culinary water use? Well, nothing is easy. There's going to be legal, water right, water quality, cost, and infrastructure and environmental consequences, notably the wetlands, depending on where you suck it out of. The biggest discharge is Mill Creek, with its surface water rights owned by the Moab Irrigation Company, which is a nonprofit, by the way. But one typical thing for, as I say, for municipalities to do is to trade agricultural uses for water for municipal uses. And the other aquifer in the area is the Valley Fill Aquifer, which has typically poor water quality because it's sitting out over an old salt dome way down deep. And now they found out that there's a briny water layer sitting underneath a somewhat thinner freshwater layer. This is kind of new. And Mark, one of his research projects with UGS, he's worried about what happens if we continue to pump more water out of particularly the lower Valley Fill Aquifer. Is there any chance that somehow briny water would upwell and contaminate, pollute, if you will, the freshwater layer? We don't know, but that Mark is intensely interested in that question because that would be another reason to stop draining the Valley Fill Aquifer. So that's research that's in the works. And finally, the county owns unused modest water rights. I think it's 3 cubic feet per second down to the Water River. They've never used it because it's expensive to pump and store. And I speculate, if you talk to John Weisheit, for example, the state's official position now is that Utah has some water to give away down the Colorado River. But I never know. I don't want to hang my hat on it, for example. In other words, it could be, they think 3 cubic feet per second isn't much on the big scheme of things, but who knows? And I think we're all going to agree more study is needed. That means money the city's going to have to ante up. Mark's already asked for money for a couple of different studies, which I will try to get. But as you guys know, particularly with COVID, the city's budget isn't in real great shape, although we are looking for it to recover here in the next year or so. So to finish up my part of the discussion and take questions, we got a painful but manageable paradigm shift in front of us. It's always been there, essentially free. Now it's going to get more complicated. And this looks like a picture of Lake Powell down here. You know, they've been struggling trying to keep water in that guy as well. So, okay, so there's much more slides in here. Talk about what an aquifer looks like, what we mean by mining the aquifer. Gets into Dr. Gardner's report, why I have more trust in it. Here's one little picture of that high area of precipitation, the channel by which it flows all the way down to the valley. And here's that same slide I showed earlier. Phil uses something called a lump parameter model, which is basically a box into which water flows way up high and comes out way down low much later. If you know the size of the box and you know how much water and how long it took for the water to move across, and you can calculate how much water is going in. And that's what Phil did. His actual model looks somewhat more complicated because he divides it up into areas where precip is falling and areas where it is not. The water falling into sand flats areas is negligible compared to the snow falling in the mountains. Finally, Phil did put air bands. There's this nifty formula. There it is, guys. I did this for a living for a long time. In aerospace business, not in water. But basically all these parameters have numbers tagged to them based on best geology. There's a lot of uncertainty in them, and we're going to argue about, gee, is it really this simple? And are these the right numbers? But right now, there's about a 50% error band of a 1 sigma error band, which roughly 50% of almost 2,000 acre feet per year, which means that Phil's safe yield estimate could range from anywhere from down below what we're withdrawing now to somewhat larger than what we're withdrawing. And if the larger number turns out to be the case, then at best we have 50% to grow on. Okay, so that's the good news. So like I say, stay tuned. And from a political point of view, make sure overnight accommodations, you know, that you do what you can to make them pay their fair share of the water budget. But you're going to have to tell residents too, the burden cannot fall entirely on them. It's going to be shared by residents as well, whether they like it or not. Okay, so I think I'll stop there. Any questions?
Thank you, Mike. That was great. I mean, I learned so much tonight. And I loved all the geology and hydrology stuff, because that's what I studied that in school. So, you know, it's near and dear to my heart. But anyway, really good. And Carly, your stuff was great.
Want me to unshare my screen?
Yeah, why don't you?
Thanks a lot, Mike. If anyone has any questions for Mike specifically, this would be the time. I think my first one is, it may be more for staff. Is there a way we can put that presentation as a link in our agenda for the meeting today? I feel like that might be the easiest way for the public to be able to review that or follow along, maybe as they're watching the meeting. That might be good. Can we do that after the fact, or?
We can do it somehow. The program that we use for the agendas is really clunky.
Okay.
So I'll work with Summer to see if we can make that happen.
Well, Nora, let me do this. I've shared this link all over the map. Let me send it to you, Nora, maybe Kyle. I know I have your address. Ruben, some of you newer guys, I'm not sure, but anyway, they can send the link on to you. It's just a pointer. If you guys open it up in city space, you'll actually get the PowerPoint presentation and not the PDF, which is fine. But yeah, let me, tonight while you guys clean up, I will send that to you, Nora. Okay, Kyle.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Mike. That'd be really helpful, because I know, you know, there's a lot of information, and certainly the slides at the end would be good to have for folks to review as we're thinking about things and trying to make recommendations to you all at City Council in the future.
Yeah, and that's something that we'll probably have to talk a little bit more about what the planning role is in all of this. And it's different states and departments and stuff do things differently in terms of water, and whether that's really more of an engineer's thing or it's a planning thing. But I think obviously if we're talking about a limited quantity and we want to start metering development based upon that, then that's definitely, you know, a planning function. So anyway, yeah, this is great. And I will send out the presentations to the planning commissioners individually, and then we'll see if we can't get them posted on the website too.
Okie dokie.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks again, Chuck and Carly as well. That was really informative. There's a lot of stuff to digest, but it's going to be really helpful as we kind of keep that in our minds when we're doing everything from here on out, pretty much.
Kaya, may I leave the meeting and I'll get you that link?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much.
Thank you guys so much for having me again.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Carly. Thanks, Chuck.
All right. Thanks, everyone. I know that was a lot of stuff to take in, but I think ultimately really useful. And I think it's important that we show the public that we're hearing all of this kind of things, including, if you haven't yet, please read the comments that we got over email relating to these issues. I know we read a couple into the record, but there were 3 more that we got in our emails that you should check out. I think the next thing is just agenda item number 4, future agenda items.
I'd like to ask Chuck a question. Oh, he just popped out.
Oh, sorry, Ruben.
I'll send an email.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea.
I think I would only like to reiterate that, you know, I really like some of Carly's suggestions and really trying to focus on some of those low-hanging fruit. Like, I'm surprised we don't have more of a water policy for the city, and watering days and all that stuff. And if we can kind of focus on those as our top priority to get done first, to show the community, yeah, water is on our radar, and this is definitely something that we want to focus on. And, you know, it's going to be an issue for years, decades. So
the desert, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I was really surprised when I moved down here and started looking at the codes and stuff that there were mandatory water conservation measures. Everywhere I've worked in Utah, there were strict, I mean, everywhere. You know, it's just sort of common sense anymore, but yeah, I was surprised.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of progress we can make relatively quickly, which is nice.
Definitely. All right, what do we have for future agenda items, Nora?
Well, apparently as of today, we received the Lions Back final master plan development and final plat for the first phase. So you'll be seeing that at some point. There'll be a fair amount of back and forth with staff, engineering, utilities, all that kind of stuff. But the Planning Commission will review it. We're still not, we haven't decided whether we want to sort of do a joint Planning Commission City Council public hearing or exactly what, but you will have a role in reviewing that. It's limited, of course, as we talked before, by the entitlements that they already have. But so what else, Corey? What do we have kind of coming down the line?
And this might be a question, is the 3rd Street Moab Townhomes project as a townhome plat, if that's coming before the Planning Commission.
Yeah.
That's
just a final plat. It's a condo plat.
Right.
So ones that are under construction, right?
Yep.
Correct.
They are very tall.
Yeah, they're at the max.
They are very I used to live in the house right next door when I first moved to Moab, and yeah, it's very tall.
I was the second story just went up, you know, and it was like, oh.
Yeah, that was my response too. Driving by was like, whoa, that is a very tall frame.
Yeah, I would like to relook at some of our residential requirements for density, but sometime. And Corey, did you get your question answered?
Yes, I think so. That was coming up. I was just confirming that Planning Commission will see it.
The other thing that it's budget time of year, and the other thing that we're thinking about, well, Joel wants to do it, but I don't think we can do it without the help of a consultant, is a complete rewrite of our code. And you know, there's some really good people out there that write great code. And it would be a huge undertaking to try to do it in-house. So it's probably going to be sort of a combination of the two. But in this next year, you're going to see it's going to be intense, which is awesome. Yeah.
Great. It's very unwieldy as it is now. It's very difficult. I spend all day at my job looking through code, and the Moab City Code is hard to find things in.
Yeah, we had a week of it with code interpretations. The last 10 days or so, it's like, but we don't know what our code says about it, or, you know, it's just like there's contradictory language, and Joel has been experiencing some of that too. So he's like, we got to fix this thing.
Yeah, that sounds great. That's a really good priority. Would there be an opportunity to make those sort of consistency amendments we were talking about in zoning, for example, in the course of those sort of streamlining efforts, or should that need to be something that's separate if it's more of a content and less of a cleanup kind of thing? Like, for example, adding certain permitted uses into a zone or removing them.
It would all be part of it.
Okay. Hooray.
It's not just formatting and cross-checking, it's changing things too.
Great. All right. Well, I think if anyone doesn't have anything to add for today, that will conclude our meeting at 7:47 p.m. Thank you everyone for showing up. Our attendance has been awesome so far this year. Let's keep that up. It's great.
I think Zoom makes it easier.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, bye everybody. Thank